Hey everybody, this is Jim from Top Jimi Profiles. Today we're demoing the Top Jimi Gilbert Lee Jackson pack for the Kemper Profiler. As you are probably aware, these were celebrity-owned amps. They were owned by Paul Gilbert, yes, that Paul Gilbert, and used to record his first two albums with Racer X in the mid to late 80s. They are both modified by Lee Jackson. They're similar in nature, but they are different. So let's talk about each one individually. This is Paul's first Lee Jackson modded Marshall. This amp started life as a 1974 50-watt non-master volume head, also known as a 1987 model. Let's go through this head. So the presence, bass, middle, and treble EQ operate pretty similar to a Marshall. I mean, you set them up mostly the same as you would with a stock Marshall. Basically bass at 0 and the other three, pretty high if not maxed out. So the two master volumes here, this one is now master number 1. This one is a preamp. And there's another master volume on the back. Input here has now been converted into a line out that could be used to drive the power amp section of some other slave amps. Let's flip around to the back and see what we have there. On the back side of the amp, we've got an effects loop, send and receive. We've got the second master volume with a push-pull switch. So push it in to defeat the master volume, pull it out to engage. We've got two extra preamp tubes, one for additional gain and one for to drive the effects loop. And the output tubes have been converted from EL34s or 6550s, whichever, to KT88s. So why do we know this is Paul's amp and not some kind of forgery or misidentification? Well, a few reasons. There are actually 3 Paul Gilbert signatures on this amp, 2 of which were etched into the actual faceplate on the front and back. So there's one signature right here in front. There's another one in the back. And then there's a handwritten signature inside the chassis. And there's also a signature from Lee Jackson dating to February of '85. So all that makes sense. I think the signature on the back is probably the most important because it was done before the mod. So if somebody were to try to forge something like this, why would they go through the effort of putting a Paul Gilbert signature on the back and then drill a hole through it and put an input jack? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So, and Paul also said this looks like the amp and it sounds just like it. You can get the Racer X tones out of this thing, no problem. So pretty sure this is Paul's real amp. So how did I end up with this amp? The amp was loaned by Paul to a friend in 1987, I believe, for that friend to use in his recording session. The amp was stolen out of that friend's car and disappeared. And it showed up on eBay roughly 2010. I don't remember the exact year. I was just looking for a modded Marshall, and a guy who lived an hour and a half from me had it for sale. He thought it might have been Paul's, but wasn't sure. So I didn't know what it was for sure. He thought it maybe had some problems, but I took a chance on it and bought it. Turns out it just needed a new pair of KT88 output tubes. So the pair that were in there, maybe they were the originals used by Paul. I don't know. But I just ended up taking a chance and hit a home run on this one. So what's cool about this amp tone-wise? I like the fact that it still sounds like a Marshall, but with more gain and a slightly more aggressive EQ. I like the fact that it's really hard to get a bad sound out of this thing. Even if you turn the preamp all the way up, you know, most modded amps, they just turn into mush, or high gain amps, it turns into mush if you turn the gain all the way up. But this thing is still voiced very nicely and is very usable, even at max gain. It's just a great sounding amp. This is the second of Paul's Lee Jackson modded Marshalls. This Marshall started life as a 75 100 watt super lead, and it is now in a pretty heavily modified state. And it took a rather circuitous route to get to where it is today, but in 1986 or late 85, I'm not sure, it was originally modded by Lee Jackson for Paul, and it was used on the second Racer X album along with the 50 watter. So those two were used in parallel. So Bruce Bouguet, who was added as the second guitarist for Racer X before the recording of the second album, is active on Facebook and some forums, and he posted this cool photo of the amps in the studio during the recording of the second album. So you can see the 50 watter on the left and the 100 watter on the right. You can tell because of the grill along the top of the 100 watter that's not present on the 50. So what else is cool about this amp? It's almost like a piece of folk art. And I think a lot of that happened when the amp was sent by Paul to his dad for some further mods. I don't know when that happened, but at that point it got the Mel Bay Rocket sign added to it. Story behind that is Paul started playing guitar using the Mel Bay series of instruction books. He actually hated them so much he quit the guitar. Can you imagine Paul Gilbert quitting guitar? Fortunately for us, he picked it up again, but his dad decided to troll him with a Mel Bay Rocket sign. So we've got the power switch has been modded to off and ignition with the standby and liftoff. Assume that was done by Paul, but could have been his dad, I don't know. It's got a button called the Mr. Big, which is some kind of basically a low resonance, I think is probably the best term for it compared to a modern amp. So it goes 0 to 11 on the Mr. Big. The presence, bass, and middle and treble are a little more aggressive than the 50 watter. But notice the treble goes to 11, whereas the others only go to 10. The master volume, it's just got a single master on it, which is on the front of the amp. There's no master on the back. Be careful, it goes to 20, not just 11. And this is a 2-channel amp, so each channel has a gain and a volume. So the volume, I guess, is your second master volume. And I believe it was set up this way so you could do a lead boost and a rhythm channel. On the back side of the amp, we again have an effects loop. The input jack has been relocated to the back of the amp. There's a half power switch and a foot switch on the back to switch between the two channels. We've got 2 extra preamp tubes, one for the effects loop and one for additional gain. And other than that, I think the power section is stock, although it's probably converted from 6550s to EL34s. But this power section gives, I think, it a fairly significant difference in output tone for this amp versus the other. The other one's got a harder tone with less fuzz a little bit. This one's a little looser sounding, I guess is probably the best term for it. I came across this amp online just like the other one. I found it either on eBay or Reverb, I forget which. And I believe I'm the third post-Paul owner of the amp. So the amp, when it was used on the second album, was in a pure Lee Jackson modded form, probably closer to the first amp. Paul then sent it to his dad, who did some mods on it and gave it the nameplate, and also changed the tone, I guess, significantly, and Paul didn't necessarily care for it, but he did use it on the Getting Heavier album before he sold it. The guy who bought it from Paul kept the certificate of authenticity. I guess it's on the wall of his office or something. So I just have a JPEG of it. Unfortunately, it didn't come with the amp. I bought it from the second owner, who I'm not sure if he did anything to the amp, but one of those two guys sent it back to Lee Jackson to convert it back to a Lee Jackson state. So it's somewhere between where Paul had it, Paul's dad had it, and where Lee Jackson finally left it. So a little bit of a circuitous route before it got to me, but this is exactly as I received the amp, and it's killer. I love it. Tone-wise, this amp is definitely in the same family as the other, the 50 watter, but it does have some differences. The EQ is definitely more aggressive, and it's got more preamp gain to it. So it is possible to get a bad tone out of this amp because of all the additional freedom you have. But if you dial it up right, it sounds amazing, just like the other. I think this is probably a later version of Lee's mods, and the other is an earlier version, is my thought. So it does have a little bit looser feel, I think, due to the EL34s versus the KT88s, but it's definitely in the same family, and it's a joy to play. In the pack, you get the tones of the first 2 Racer X albums, which we painstakingly recreated, as well as each amp through 3 different speakers. A 67 20-watt greenback, a 1970 25-watt greenback, and a vintage 30, the new version, but the Mesa version, which sounds better than the Chinese version. So you get a wide variety of tones available in this pack. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and we'll see you next time.